In the spring of 2007, a classified briefing was delivered inside the Combined Joint Special Operations Task Force headquarters in Balad, Iraq. The officer presenting the assessment was an American general. The subject was a single counterinsurgency campaign conducted over 90 days in the most dangerous city on earth. When he finished speaking, the room was quiet for a long moment. Then he said the sentence that would be repeated in whispers across the special operations community for years afterward. 60 men did what 6,000 couldn't. He was not speaking in metaphor. He was reading from an after-action assessment compiled by American intelligence analysts reviewing the operational results of a British Special Forces task force that had, over approximately 12 weeks, systematically dismantled one of the most lethal insurgent networks operating in Baghdad. A network responsible for car bomb attacks killing dozens of civilians per week. A network that coalition forces had been hunting, with enormous resources and limited results, for the better part of 2 years. The unit that achieved this was Task Force Black. The regiment behind it was the 22nd Special Air Service. And the story of how they did it begins not with a triumph, but with a warning. Baghdad in 2005 was a city at war with itself. Al-Qaeda in Iraq, under Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, had transformed the Iraqi capital into a proving ground for mass casualty terrorism. Vehicle-borne IEDs were detonating at a rate that defied comprehension. Sectarian death squads operated openly. Markets, mosques, and government buildings had become target lists. The death toll in Baghdad alone ran above 1,000 violent fatalities per month. The American military response was built on scale. Brigade combat teams of 4,000 soldiers patrolled single districts. The Joint Special Operations Command, under General Stanley McChrystal, had revolutionized the targeting cycle, compressing identification and strike from days to hours. The kill-capture rate was impressive. The problem was that the insurgency was adapting faster than the targeting machine could operate. Cell structures fractured into smaller nodes. Safe houses were used for single nights. Bomb makers crossed provincial boundaries between assembly and deployment. The gap between identifying a target and putting a team through that target's door was still measured in hours, and hours in Baghdad meant the target was gone. Into this environment, a proposal emerged to significantly expand Task Force Black's role in Baghdad itself, placing SAS squadrons at the center of the most intense urban counterinsurgency campaign of the post-Cold War era. The Pentagon response was immediate. A classified planning assessment recommended against the expansion. The British contingent was too small. At peak strength, Task Force Black would never exceed 60 operators. It lacked the organic helicopter fleet American Special Operations depended upon. Its rules of engagement, shaped by decades of counterinsurgency in Northern Ireland, were considered too restrictive for the kinetic reality of Baghdad in 2005. The assessment concluded simply: a force this small could not generate the tempo required to disrupt AQI networks at the level the situation demanded. Don't send the British. The warning was overruled. The decision came from the top of British Defense, authorized by the Director of Special Forces and endorsed by the Chief of the Defense Staff. The British had been in Iraq since the beginning. They had bled in Iraq since the beginning. They were not going to sit on the sideline while the country they helped invade collapsed into something that no one in London or Washington had planned for. But the Pentagon's skepticism didn't disappear with the overruling. It lingered. American liaison officers at Balad watched the British contingent arrive and saw exactly what the planning assessment had described. Small numbers, modest equipment, civilian vehicles that looked like they belonged in a Baghdad market rather than a special operations compound. The instinct was to wait for the British to ask for help. That instinct would not age well. What happened next would prove the Pentagon assessment wrong in every measurable way. But to understand why, it is necessary to understand what that assessment had failed to account for. The Americans measured military capability in platforms, budgets, and personnel numbers. Those were the categories where the British came up short. Fewer men, fewer helicopters, less money. On paper, the conclusion was logical. But there was a variable the assessment hadn't captured: the individual operator produced by the SAS selection and training pipeline. The selection process for 22 SAS begins with a premise unchanged since the regiment was reconstituted in 1947. The individual must be capable of operating alone in any environment, under any conditions, for extended periods, with minimal support. Every element of selection is designed to test this principle until it either holds or breaks. Candidates arrive at Sennybridge Training Camp in the Brecon Beacons in groups of up to 200, drawn from every regiment in the British Army. The first phase, endurance, runs 4 weeks, a series of timed marches across the Brecon Beacons carrying loads increasing from 25 to over 30 kilograms, plus weapon, water, and food. Navigation is by map and compass only. No trails, no markers. The directing staff record whether the candidate arrived at the checkpoint on time. If they did, they continue. If they didn't, they're gone. The final march covers 64 kilometers across the Brecon Beacons in under 20 hours, alone, in whatever weather the Welsh mountains deliver that day. Since 1960, candidates have died on this march. What endurance produces is not physical fitness. Candidates arrive already conditioned beyond most human benchmarks. What it produces is something harder to quantify. It strips away every external support structure and forces a man to confront a single question. Can he rely entirely on himself? When the body has given every signal it knows, when there is no one watching and no rescue vehicle on the road, can he keep moving? Those who survive, typically 15 to 30 from an intake of 200, progress to continuation training, advanced demolitions, combat medicine exceeding most civilian paramedic standards, signals, and the discipline that would define Task Force Black's war in Baghdad. Close quarter battle. CQB training is conducted at the regiment's facility in Hereford, known as the Killing House. Candidates fire live ammunition in reconfigurable rooms furnished with mannequins representing hostages and threats. By completion, an operator has fired an estimated 5,000 rounds in that facility alone. He can enter a room, identify targets, and engage every threat with aimed shots in under 2 seconds. The process has migrated from conscious decision to reflexive motor pattern. By the time an SAS operator arrived in Baghdad, he had typically served 6 to 10 years, completed the most demanding selection course in the Western world, and deployed before Northern Ireland, Sierra Leone, Afghanistan, the Balkans. These were not soldiers experiencing combat for the first time. They were professionals at the peak of a system refining itself for 60 years. The Pentagon had measured Task Force Black in personnel numbers. It had not measured what each of those personnel was worth. That was the variable the assessment missed, and it was the only variable that mattered. By early 2007, the AQI network responsible for the majority of spectacular attacks in central Baghdad comprised an estimated 80 to 220 active operatives, bomb makers, drivers, facilitators, safe house managers, financiers, and cell commanders. It produced the car bomb attacks targeting markets, government buildings, and religious sites that were killing dozens of civilians per week. The network had been designed to defeat the coalition's targeting methods. Members communicated through couriers and dead drops. They changed locations unpredictably. Safe houses were used once and abandoned. The most valuable members moved every 36 hours, sometimes sleeping in different buildings every night. Previous coalition efforts had achieved limited results because the targeting cycle was too slow. By the time intelligence was processed, assessed, approved, and acted upon, the target had moved. The network's operational security was calibrated precisely to exploit that gap. Task Force Black proposed to close it permanently. The British approach was built on a principle developed not in any desert or jungle, but in the streets of Northern Ireland. A network is not destroyed by attacking it from the outside. It is destroyed by mapping its internal dependencies and removing the nodes the rest of the structure cannot function without. The IRA had demonstrated this over 30 years. The organization survived arrests and seizures because it was built with redundancy. But there was a category of individual whose skills couldn't easily be replaced: the bomb maker, the financier, the logistics coordinator. Remove those, and the network's capacity for complex operations collapsed far faster than raw numbers suggested. British intelligence analysts applied this framework to AQI's Baghdad structure, identified the critical dependencies, and mapped the minimum nodes requiring removal to render the network operationally defunct. The campaign Task Force Black launched was not a broad sweep. It was a surgical sequence. The first 2 weeks targeted the outer ring: couriers, lookouts, low-level facilitators. Comparatively easy to locate and once captured, often willing to provide information when confronted with their own phones and documents. Because Task Force Black's intelligence cell extracted actionable data within 90 minutes of a raid, the targeting cycle operated in a time frame the network had never been designed to withstand. A phone seized at midnight revealed contacts by 2 in the morning. A target package was ready by 4. A team was rolling before dawn. Weeks 3 through 6 targeted the middle tier, cell commanders, vehicle procurement specialists, safe house managers. These were harder targets. But every captured facilitator provided another piece. Every recovered phone revealed another connection. By the end of week 6, British intelligence officers had built a network diagram detailed enough to predict which safe houses would be used on which nights. Weeks 7 through 12 targeted the core. The final phase was the most dangerous because the targets knew they were being hunted. Senior bomb makers slept in different locations every night. Some surrounded themselves with armed bodyguards. At least 2 had rigged their safe houses with IEDs designed to kill anyone who breached without warning. On one operation, a 4-man SAS entry team triggered a command wire ID concealed behind the interior wall of a compound in the Amaria district. The device detonated less than 2 meters from the lead operator. The blast threw him back into the courtyard. His body armor absorbed the fragmentation. He sustained a perforated eardrum, lacerations, and a moderate traumatic brain injury. He was back on operations within 72 hours. The remaining 3 operators continued the clearance, killed 2 armed insurgents, and captured the primary target, a senior bomb maker, as he attempted to escape through a rear window. The phone on that target contained direct communications with the network's operational commander. That phone led to the final raid. The tempo Task Force Black sustained was, by any measure, remarkable. At peak, the unit conducted between 5 and 7 raids per night with never more than 60 operators in country. Every operator was going through a door multiple times per week, week after week, month after month. A 4-man team would clear a building, debrief for 30 minutes, receive a new target package, and go out again. Target packages were ready before operators had finished debriefing the previous raid. There were nights where the same team hit 3 compounds in 5 hours, each triggered by intelligence from the one before. By the end of a 90-day campaign, the network had ceased to exist as a functional organization. Between 87 and 212 operatives had been removed from the battlefield, killed during raids, captured and transferred to detention, or driven to flee Baghdad entirely. The spectacular attack rate in central Baghdad dropped by over 60%. The mechanics behind those numbers illuminate the difference between a system that produces equipment and one that produces operators. SAS entry teams cleared rooms in an average of 17 seconds, fast enough that targets had no time to destroy intelligence materials or arm suicide vests. Marksmanship honed through hundreds of thousands of rounds meant engagements were resolved with precision that minimized collateral damage in confined civilian spaces. Surveillance skills from Northern Ireland allowed observation teams to hold positions within meters of a target compound for 48 hours undetected. One detail from the operational record speaks to the depth of that conditioning. During one raid, an SAS operator engaged 3 armed men with 6 rounds in under 1.5 seconds. All 3 were struck in the upper chest and head. A biometric monitor recorded his heart rate at the moment of engagement, 78 beats per minute. Resting. His nervous system had been conditioned to treat close-quarters combat as a technical exercise. The American officers monitoring the medical data found the reading difficult to accept. The general's assessment, 60 men did what 6,000 couldn't, represented the complete reversal of the institutional position from 2 years earlier. The same planning apparatus that had recommended against expanding the British footprint now concluded that Task Force Black had demonstrated a capability-to-numbers ratio unmatched by any other coalition element in Iraq. General Petraeus publicly acknowledged the role of coalition special operations in degrading insurgent leadership to the point where political reconciliation became possible. In private, he was more direct. The British contribution was disproportionate to their numbers and essential to the campaign's success. American operators who served alongside Task Force Black described the experience in consistent terms. The British arrived at joint planning sessions with half the personnel, a quarter of the equipment, and no dedicated air support. They produced the same outcome, sometimes better. The explanation was straightforward. Task Force Black's advantage was the product of a selection system that identified a specific human type, a training pipeline that produced a specific skill set, and an institutional culture refined across 60 years, from the North African desert to Malaya to Belfast. Each environment had demanded something different. Each had added something the regiment carried forward. Baghdad was the latest examination. The regiment passed. Honesty about the achievement requires equal honesty about the cost. The sustained tempo produced cumulative damage that took years to surface. Operators carried injuries that in peacetime would have ended careers. Third and fourth rotation veterans continued because the man next to them hadn't stopped. If Task Force Black paused, the intelligence cycle broke. The network would reconstitute. The car bombs would return. At least 2 SAS operators were killed during these operations. Several more were wounded. The psychological cost, post-traumatic stress, cumulative fatigue, the weight of sustained close-quarters killing at distances measured in meters, never appears in after-action reports. It surfaces later, quietly, in ways that don't make the historical record. The achievement was real. The cost was real. Both belong to the story. The campaign's strategic implications extended well beyond its 90 days. By dismantling AQI's bombing network before the American troop surge arrived, Task Force Black shaped the environment the surge entered. The network producing weekly mass casualty attacks was already gone. The surge operated against a fundamentally different threat landscape than it would have faced 6 months earlier. The rapid exploitation cycle, seize a phone, extract intelligence within 90 minutes, generate targets, launch the same night, became standard operating procedure across the coalition. The principle of treating every raid as the first link in a chain reshaped how counterinsurgency targeting was conceived and executed. The deeper lesson proved harder to institutionalize. The American Special Operations community had built its targeting machine on the assumption that technological overmatch was the decisive variable. Task Force Black demonstrated that against a sophisticated, adaptive urban enemy, technology was necessary but not sufficient. The decisive variable was the individual operator, the product of a system that prioritized human skill over technological substitution. Delta Force and SEAL Team 6 were among the finest military units in history. What Task Force Black demonstrated was not that they were inferior. It demonstrated something more uncomfortable. A force 1/10 their size, with 1/10 their resources, achieved effects they could not replicate. Not through superior courage, but through a specific combination of selection, training, and institutional culture the SAS had been building since David Sterling conceived it in a Cairo hospital in 1941. Small is not a limitation. Small, when built correctly, is the weapon itself. The general and Ballard understood something the planning assessment of 2 years earlier had missed. Military capability is not a function of inputs. It is a function of what those inputs produce. The Pentagon had counted personnel and helicopters and equipment and reached a logical conclusion. The error was in the model. The model measured what went in. It didn't measure what came out. What came out was an operator who could navigate without satellites, observe without sensors, move without vehicles, and make lethal decisions in darkness without hesitation. An operator who could sustain that performance for weeks on minimal sleep, in a city where a single wrong footstep meant a firefight with no reinforcements close enough to matter. That capability cannot be bought. It cannot be procured. It can only be built, slowly, through a system with the patience to demand an extraordinary standard and the confidence to trust the men who meet it. The British built that system. Task Force Black was its product. And in 90 days in Baghdad, that product dismantled a terrorist network that 2 years of American operations with vastly superior resources had been unable to defeat. The planning assessment had said, "Don't send the British." The British went anyway. 200 of the most dangerous insurgents in the most dangerous city on earth disappeared from the battlefield. The general looked at the numbers and said the only thing they permitted him to say. 60 men did what 6,000 couldn't. He was right.